Hey, podcast listeners. I'm Chris Morocco, food director of Bon Appetit and Epicurious, and host of the Dinner SOS podcast. Each week on the show, we bring the expertise of the Bon Appetit test kitchen to your kitchen. And this season, we've got a little something for everyone. We're debating whether spring produce is actually worth all the hype, solving your hosting anxieties, and helping you become a better baker with our BA Bake Club episodes on Dinner SOS.
When I asked people researching this book, what is your favorite gay restaurant? A lot of times people had no idea. But then I asked them a follow-up question. Where did you go after the clubs? And almost to a person, they said, oh, well, we all went to this diner after the clubs and everyone was drunk and we had burgers and I flirted, because they were open.
This is Taste. I'm your host, Eliza Barbanel. What is queer food? Today, we're having a special roundtable discussion with the authors of two great new books unpacking the topic in exciting and unexpected ways. John Birdsall is the author of The Man Who Ate Too Much, The Life of James Beard, and the wonderful new book, What is Queer Food? How We Served a Revolution. Erik Piepenburg is a reporter and the author of Dining Out, First Dates, Defiant Nights, and Last Call Disco Fries at America's Gay Restaurants. I loved both of these books, and I'm so grateful for this lively conversation that looks to the past, present, and future of queer food. Erik Piepenburg, John Birdsall, this is Taste. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I feel like we've convened a really special group of people today, both in the studio and over Zoom, to talk about this big question of queer food and what that means. And I think I've noticed this kind of conversation happening in food media for a while, but I think especially in recent years about trying to define this as like a cuisine or a culture. And both of your books that are coming out this June, I think, approach it from very different but also similar ways. So I'm really excited to chat with you both. I think as someone from a younger generation and from maybe a different part of the alphabet in LGBTQ, I really enjoyed reading this book and getting to learn about all of these people and places that, are important elders, but maybe not a part of the present day. So I think there's a lot to chat about. I guess to start, I'm wondering if each of you, maybe Erik to start, could tell me an early memory you have of eating in a queer space.
Yeah, well, I think I would have to say for me it was in high school in Cleveland. There was a diner that all the weird kids went to, the drama nerds, the choir people, the new wavers, the goths. We're talking the late 80s. And there was one diner where everybody went after the clubs or after a Skinny Puppy show at the Fantasy Theater, and it was called My Friends. And I was deeply closeted at the time, and I had no idea. I mean, I sort of knew that I was gay, but I certainly never thought I would come out. And so I had I didn't self-identify as gay yet, but I knew that there was something different about being in this diner at midnight with all these weird kids who sort of looked like me. And I remember there was this one guy there who wore, late 80s trench coat and sort of big bangs. And I just remember being so drawn to him. And that's a very early memory of me sort of not cruising exactly, but kind of staring at him and sort of wanting to be him, wanting to be with him, while I'm also having like a giant serving of pancakes and scrambled eggs with my weird friends. That I think today we would call that a space being queered, but we didn't have that kind of language in the 80s. So I look back and I think, oh yeah, that was a queer space because us weird kids who, in my case, turned out to be gay, all sort of knew, well, this is the place to go.
I love that memory. And there is something about diners. I think about going to the diner in high school in LA. We'd go to this place called Swingers, weirdly enough.
Oh, yeah. I know Swingers.
Yeah. And Erik, in the book, you kind of write about being a diner gay. What does that mean to you?
Yeah. A diner gay is someone who has memories and has enjoyed and continues to go to diners, which I think are an undervalued queer space when we talk about gay restaurants. And what I love about diners is that they are they're different queer spaces from bars in the sense that they are open to everyone. You can be 16 years old or you can be 80 years old, and you don't want the expensive cocktails and the loud music. You just want to sit there and enjoy a meal. The prices generally are not too bad. There's food for everyone. So they're very egalitarian queer spaces that are not centered around necessarily sex or music or drugs or drinking or the things that you would associate with a bar. And so I think diners should be valued for those types of spaces. It's interesting. When I asked people researching this book, what is your favorite gay restaurant? A lot of times people had no idea. But then I asked them a follow-up question. Where did you go after the clubs? And almost to a person, they said, oh, well, we all went to this diner after the clubs and everyone was drunk and we had burgers and I flirted, and 9 times out of 10, that was a diner because they were open 24 hours usually. And in a lot of cases, for me, at least growing up, living in Chicago and DC and New York, they were not far from the gay bars. And you could easily go there after the club. And then the people who ate there changed around 8 or 9, but you go back there the next night, starting around midnight, and it's gay again. Yeah. There is this queer life cycle of a diner that you don't really have at gay bars or other restaurants.
Yeah, I love this idea. John, what's your early food memory?
Well, for me, it's a domestic space, I guess you'd call it. I was growing up in a suburb of San Francisco, and in the 1960s, I was a small boy. These guys moved in next door, kind of like across from this little canyon where we lived, and they were this gay couple, and we called them. My brother and I called them uncles, Uncle Pat and Uncle Lou, and they became really close friends with my parents. Even though the rest of the neighborhood really looked down on them, and sort of, used to give my parents grief for, having these men be their friends. But the amazing thing to me, being a little boy of, 7, 8, 9, was we would go over there often when my parents, wanted a night out alone. And so they would take us over there to be babysat, and Pat and Lou just had this charmed, amazing life. They drank cocktails. They had these sort of matching upholstered chairs that they sat in as they drank their cocktails. They had this little toy schnauzer who ran around, and we loved him. And then Lou would cook. And the thing that I remember him cooking most of all, which I've written about in the past, are these burgers, which were just unlike anything I'd ever had before. Certainly, not in a restaurant, and they were definitely not the kind of meager, budget conscious burgers that my mom would cook. But these were huge. They were covered with blue cheese and Dijon mustard and I think caramelized onions. Really, a difficult thing for an 8-year-old to try to eat. But it was just this magnificent life that these guys lived outside of the normal family rules and strictures that I knew as a kid. They didn't seem to have to care about bedtimes or about watching the right television shows, or we could get by with not having to brush our teeth. And it was just they would have parties sometimes, and their gay friends from San Francisco would come, and my brother and I were allowed to watch maybe the first hour of the party, and then my parents would take us home and the real party would start. But it was just this world of buffets and Broadway show tune cast albums on their stereo. And it seemed completely limitless in terms of fun, pleasure. It just kind of cracked the world open for me as a young boy. Just opened my eyes to something that was possible, and something that had a definite menu attached, which was incredible, dangerous, rich food.
I love that memory, and I find it so striking that, Erik, your book is so much about dining out in restaurants, as the name suggests. And John, your book has some restaurant scenes, but I think a lot of it is about home cooking as well, and these
Yes,
kind
for
of
sure.
more private queer spaces. And John, I mean, you're touching on this kind of like intimacy and domesticity a little bit, but I'm curious, like when you were thinking about this book, what kind of drew you to this more like personal home cooking side of queer food?
Well, I sort of came up, after that sort of world was over for me, and I grew up. When I came out myself, like right after college in San Francisco, and this was in like the early 1980s. Um, it was just, it was a world not so much of restaurants, even though I was cooking in restaurants, but the gay circles that I was in, the friends that I had, everyone was a great cook, and everyone would have these essentially, sort of sprawling dinner parties where, there was this friend of mine named Mark who would like take on a different cookbook author, like he'd take on, Julie Sani, the Indian cookbook author, or he'd take on Marcella Hazan and just do kind of dinners, kind of idolizing these women cookbook authors for these big gay like dinner parties. And so much of my life trying to figure out what, gay, lesbian, queer food could be was thinking about it in the domestic space, not so much restaurants, but through cookbooks and through home cooking and the ways that people, all my gay and lesbian friends live differently. Like we were all somewhat struggling financially, and we would figure out ways to cook and to entertain each other, where the food was as creative as it could be, and just express this. I guess later I realized it was sort of family building, like how you built deep relationships and essentially a community by cooking and having people over and, building these sort of sprawling family units.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. And, world building kind of comes to mind to me as well in terms of these kind of like alternate timeline, alternate universe, fantasy worlds people can build together. And Erik, I think when you were talking about diners, you spoke to kind of the way that they can serve all kinds of people and the times of day that they're accessible. I'm wondering like what other purposes you see restaurants specifically serving for queer folks.
Yeah, I think they serve spaces of safety. You can be at a gay restaurant and hold your partner's hand or kiss, things that you may not necessarily be comfortable doing in other spaces. I think traditionally gay restaurants have also, not across the board, but many of them have also doubled as community centers or places of activism. There was a restaurant during the ACT UP years, the AIDS activist group, where every Monday night after the meeting at the Gay and Lesbian Community Center here in New York, they'd go to Woody's, and they would basically take over a room at Woody's, which was an Italian restaurant in the West Village, and just sort of keep the meeting going because their friends were dying and they needed a place to go to sort of meet and continue their activism. And so I think that's another way that gay restaurants have sort of served different communities in a way that's more than just good food or camaraderie, but also spaces that are about mobilization and also safety.
Yeah, and also like economic, like gay restaurants employ gay people.
Yeah, that's true. Employ gay people, gay chefs. It's interesting. In my book, I really focused more on who is eating there, but in a lot of cases, they do hire gay people. But I should say also, just because a restaurant has a gay chef or gay employees doesn't necessarily, in my definition at least, make it a gay restaurant.
Yeah, you talk about, I can't remember the name right now, the DC brunch restaurant that's very famous.
Yeah, Perry's.
Yeah, and basically the whole family who runs it, none of them are gay.
That's true. Also, Annie's Steakhouse in D.C., as far as I know, none of the people who run those restaurants that are have traditionally been very, very gay, a little bit less so these in recent years, but nobody there is gay. They just sort of tapped into the gay community. Perry's for a really long-running drag brunch, and Annie's just because it was in the middle of the gay neighborhood. And they have opened their doors to the gay community. But as far as I know, they're about as straight as you get.
But they're very good. They're part of the community in another way, I guess.
Absolutely.
I think this kind of draws me to one of my big questions for both of you, which is how did you go about like defining queer food in the context of the book? Maybe even in your reporting process, like how did you decide that something was worthy of inclusion or kind of fit the theme?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I looked at if I had wanted to do a comprehensive book about gay restaurants, that would be impossible. It would be an 800-page list. And so, because I think in a lot of ways there have been more gay restaurants than gay bars, just because of the nature and how I define a gay restaurant, which is basically it's a restaurant where there are a bunch of gay people eating at any given moment. So I had a really, really hard time sort of figuring out, well, these restaurants are worth including and not. In some cases, it would just happen to be these were gay restaurants that I knew or I had heard of or I had been curious about. And I asked lots of gay people, where did you eat? Where do you eat? And sort of went off of that. But there are so many restaurants that I just did not get the chance to go to. And what I love is that in John's book, he has restaurants that I didn't include, and he has restaurants that I've never heard of before. And so I think it's fascinating that we both have sort of looked at the world of gay restaurants and decided we're taking two very different paths of the kinds of restaurants that we wanted to choose. I think that's a fascinating way to look at what a gay restaurant is and the importance that they have, that we've kind of in some ways gone in two different directions.
Yeah, I loved that sense of discovery that I got from reading your book. And also it did really kind of expand, even my sense of what a gay restaurant could be. I mean, I was much more focused on, I think, food and cooking and specific dishes in the restaurants that I do talk about. But I love your, I guess, definition or sort of, kind of yardstick for figuring out whether a restaurant is gay, whether a restaurant is queer, by just sort of if it, the balance of probability, queer probability of the people in there. I also love that you, I think it's Ruby Fruit in LA,
Yeah,
where you sort of show up and it's all these amazing young lesbians, perceived lesbians who are filling the dining room, and you're wondering if you and your partner, the two men in the room, are diluting the queerness of this place. If in fact you are the problem, sort of de-queering spaces as you go. What I like about that, your kind of sensitivity to that and kind of puzzling out what how to define queer space, is how, very much what the experience of eating in these places has been for me my whole life, which is figuring out if I feel safe, if we feel safe, and if we feel seen in that way, like, people are going to appreciate, the servers and whoever, the cooks peeking out through the window are going to appreciate who we are and that we're there, and that, we're not sort of some kind of hostile, small hostile minority in this space. So I think it gets to the difficulty of figuring out, trying to figure out queer food, what it is, how it's worked in our communities, and how queer dining spaces have figured in our communities.
Yeah, I think that really resonates. And I think for me, reading it as like a younger queer person, like there are so many places in both of your books that I read about that I just wished I could, magically be at that table, be with those people in those spaces. I think just all across the country, all over these different decades, all the different kinds of cuisine, like both of your books made me feel like, oh, these could be my people. These could have been my people. I could have been at that table. And I think it's difficult in this moment because there's so much access to spaces through social media and like the way that we share things online. But I found myself, obviously it was really challenging to be queer in these earlier periods of time, but almost like wistful for this era that was like so removed from the online sphere, and that when you were physically present somewhere, like that was the only place your brain was, or that you were. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, I know for me at my favorite diner, the Melrose Diner in Chicago, this was, before apps, before you could go online and meet people. And some of my most treasured memories of eating there are by myself at 3 o'clock in the morning with a book. Not tempted by Grindr or Scruff because those weren't an option. Like if you wanted to meet someone for an assignation or for whatever reason, you had to go out and you had to be in a space or cruise each other on the street. Those were your only options. And I really do treasure that. I'm happy that apps and our digital age has changed the way that gay people find one another. But man, if I could go back to the Melrose and sit by myself and just read a book, I would do that.
I was once doing a story, like reporting a story about, the story about the death of gay bars. And I wanted to talk to someone who was a lot younger, who, came out not knowing the old school gay bar archetype that I knew. And he was like, yeah, he said, I sometimes think about gay bars, how they used to be. He said, and it just freaks me out. It's like, imagine like you're in a space and anyone in the room could come up to you. Like there's no way that you can filter them out as you can with like one of the apps. And it was just like, wow, what a huge cultural shift. It's unthinkable to me.
Yeah, it really is. It really
live in this world where you could sort of pre-filter out people because, bars and gay restaurants. I think about eating out in like Provincetown in the 1980s, like the idea that you wouldn't know who was going to be in the room when you got there. You knew that they would be mostly gay and lesbian, folks who were eating there and working there, of course. But the idea that you wouldn't know exactly who you might make eye contact with, who you might talk with, who you might, end up either sleeping with or just sort of getting to know in a way. It's just, now when we talk about it, it sounds really exhilarating. Then back in those days, not knowing anything different, it just seemed like that was how you lived a gay life. You went to places where other people like you were, and you tried to make connections.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think some of the notable examples of queer restaurants that I've been to today, Little Deb's Oasis in Hudson is one of them that appears in both of your books. La Copine in Joshua Tree. Have either of you been?
I have always wanted to go, and I have never made it. But
I'll speak for the Sapphic contingency with this restaurant, but it's really quite special. I believe like copine is slang for girlfriend in French, which is the name. But it's out in Joshua Tree, and I was there a couple years ago, right after a Courtney Barnett concert that was out there, who's a famous, very talented musician, also a lesbian. And when I was out at the show that night, my friend saw this cute guy. We had a great time. And the next morning went to this restaurant for brunch, which is one of the only restaurants in Joshua Tree in general, and certainly one of the places to go to for brunch. We saw the cute boy who happened to be a bartender there. We saw Courtney Barnett, who was eating in the table next door. We saw half of the crowd of the show the night before. And I think it speaks to maybe partially this sense of like concentrated geography that in Hudson or in Joshua Tree, when there are less places to go in general, a lot of people of the same kind will go there. Certainly here in New York, there are plenty of queer restaurants and spaces that people will go to. But I think I feel less of a need to go there necessarily because I have my community already here. So that the geographical impact, I think, is maybe different.
And it does seem like there is also a thirst, or at least I've found. I was at a party recently with millennials and some Gen Z folks, and there's this thirst for this third space. Where can we go where you could meet other queer people and it's not a bar? I said, well, how about restaurants? And it's almost as if that hadn't sort of like occurred to this group of people that, oh, right, like we can have queer restaurants or queer bookstores or other places that when I was in the 90s, those were everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so it does seem like there is a thirst again to sort of say, wait, I don't want these other spaces that traditionally have been queer spaces. I want something different. And I think restaurants can still be those types of places.
Yeah. So, okay, we're talking about restaurants. I want to talk about like other kinds of queer food. And I feel like brunch is a really obvious category of like this meal that is considered to be very queer. I'm wondering if either or both of you could speak to like why we have that connotation with brunch.
Well, it's funny, yeah, because both Eric and I, we sort of quote the same sort of origin of brunch, the sort of creation of the neologism brunch in sort of 1890s Britain. It sort of vacillated. It became a sort of general kind of straight, trendy meal in the 1930s and 40s, like in New York City, like fancy hotels might have, a fancy brunch that was for everybody. Queer people quickly latched onto brunch. I mean, of course, it makes sense because it's basically a meal where at the start of the day or maybe the night before hasn't ended, you can just continue drinking and socializing and cruising. And also it takes over so much of the day. I mean, it could start at 10 or 11 a.m. or brunch could start at 2 or 3 p.m. It's something that is boundaryless. And for me, it kind of fit a profile of queerness that is about subverting the sort of narrow, straight patriarchal expectations that most of us grew up with, that we were supposed to keep our drinking, keep our, restaurant eating, keep our socializing to these narrow boxes. And brunch just, blew the sides off those boxes so that we could just, if you drank, you could be absolutely hammered in the middle of the day and you could, end up in somebody's apartment, and then go right back and do it over again. It wasn't about, keeping a proper life so that you could be a good employee, you could be the good cog in the capitalist system where, you would have to get up and go to work the next day. You could just, brunch allowed people just to sprawl, in terms of their being together and, hooking up and just experiencing pleasure. So it's definitely the, quintessential queer meal, if you can even call it a meal.
It's a lifestyle, yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Eric, does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. I think John is totally right. And I would also add that for me, I somewhat also traced it back to the 90s when brunch gay brunch had sort of already become a thing. But in the 90s, when there were AIDS fundraisers, often straight people would go to a daytime event, a brunch with entertainers or drag, but they wouldn't go to a gay restaurant at night, or they certainly wouldn't go to a club, but they would go to a daytime event. And so there was this blossoming of understanding that brunch, from those roots as AIDS fundraisers, could also be a place for entertainment. And then you fast forward to today, and as I say in my book, I'm not a huge fan of drag brunch today. I think it's sort of been watered down a little bit, but it is more popular than ever. But that's what happens when this very queer event sort of enters the mainstream. It becomes, I think I make the case in my book, it becomes diluted a little bit. It's just less queer. It's less cutting edge than it was before. That's not a bad thing necessarily. I think if drag queens are getting work, restaurants are open and humming. But for me, the drag brunches that I remember, it's just not, it's not quite the same. It's been a little watered down, but still go drag brunch.
Yeah. I mean, I think, drag brunch has really elevated drag queens in a way. I mean, you're absolutely right. It also dilutes what is transgressive, what is subversive about drag queens, and has made drag queens more wholesome, I think, in just this sort of public consciousness. But it's also elevated drag queens as, to be essential parts of not only the restaurant economy, but also just sort of our culture. Brunch drag acts, I mean, obviously are quite different from bar drag acts that happen in, certain bars later at night. they can get more thirsty, I guess. And
Yep.
it's, which is so, it's great that I'm really happy that drag has been elevated in this way, that it's been embraced in this way, even though, I would not, there are probably few drag brunches I would actually want to go to.
Yeah.
Especially after reading your book, Eric. It's like, oh, that's right. Yeah.
That-
all the bachelorettes and
Yeah, that's true. Although, look, I will say one of the most fun I've had at a drag brunch was I wrote a piece about Taco Bell's drag brunch, which was a hoot. I would do a Taco Bell drag brunch in a heartbeat.
Yeah, did they do that anymore, or is that was like a one-off?
I think that was a one-off Pride Month sort of promotion.
It was in like the previous era of corporations buying into Pride.
Correct. That is not so. I don't think Taco Bell's going to be doing that this year.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about with drag brunch to me feels like this bigger kind of evolution of like the commodification and capitalization of queer culture, and Hamburger Mary's, which I think, you write about going from a one-off kind of community space restaurant into this chain that now has a very different concept of like the queerness that they're creating and selling. It to me seems like this kind of larger shift that you notice happening in restaurants. I guess I'm curious if you feel like that still is at play right now. I feel like we're, per the comment about Pride corporate buy-in, like I think that maybe some of like the mass commodification of queerness that was popular 5 years ago, 10 years ago, like maybe is not really as present right now.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think Hamburger Mary's is less about corporatization of drag, which I think is alive and well and will continue to be in some ways, less than it was certainly even just a year ago. But with Hamburger Mary's, I think what surprised me there was the extent to which the drag show that I went to at the Hamburger Mary's in West Hollywood, of all places, was really not that gay. There was a drag queen there, and there were some gay men working there, and there was me. But to my eyes, it did not look gay at all compared to when Hamburger Mary's first opened in the late 70s, when it was right near the gay bars, and gay men would go back and forth between the bars, and then they'd get a burger and go back to the bars, and then the sex club. It's not that anymore. And so I ask in the book, well, is it a gay restaurant anymore if there are no gay people there? And I'm not sure I have the answer, but to me, it didn't feel gay, and that really surprised me.
I mean, I think, having come out in San Francisco a long time ago when Hamburger Mary's was, still in its heyday, I think about the first Pride marches that I went to in San Francisco in the early 80s and how uncorporate they were. I mean, you would not see a faith group, you wouldn't see like a church or
Chase Bank.
Yeah. I mean, you definitely would not see Chase Bank. And I mean, the mayor of San Francisco would not, you would not see politicians except the few, the one gay city supervisor in San Francisco. I mean, you would not see non-queer politicians march in gay pride marches. And the thing about Hamburger Mary's was that, starting, in the early 1980s, the fact that it got discovered by straight people, by trendy straight people, by, kind of wealthy straight people, like women who would come after playing tennis and, sort of gawk at the sort of gorgeous, hunky waiters. It felt like, that definitely felt like a political act. It felt like the straight people were coming to gay spaces because what we could build, what we built in restaurants, what we built in just public spaces was really awesome. It was hilarious. It was challenging. It was subversive. And it felt like, we as a gay community had really made it because they were coming to us. Like we weren't going into straight spaces and feeling, wondering if we could maybe hold hands under the table. They were coming into our spaces and having to look at who we were and having to respect in a way who we were, even though they might make fun of us. But that was the real power, I think, of places like Hamburger Mary's that became, that sort of lost lost their community power. I mean, it is kind of amazing that that chain, for instance, has like survived after so many decades. But I see it as part of this historical evolution of queer power, which is something that I was really interested in, wanted to, felt like, I think both Erik's book and my book took that on. Like how did the power dynamic shift in food and cooking and cookbooks and just domestic spaces? Like, how did queer people overcome so much stigma and so much homophobia to sort of build something that feels central to the culture? And I think that's the story of queer food and queer restaurant spaces.
Yeah, I think it's really worthwhile to remember like the origin of Hamburger Mary and how it evolved over time. And another restaurant, John, that you mentioned in your book that I was just so intrigued about was Cafe Nicholson, which was opened in 1948 in New York by Johnny Nicholson, and Edna Lewis was the chef there. And I'd heard a little bit about Cafe Nicholson just as this like bohemian downtown space. And when you go on the Wikipedia page, like it doesn't mention gay people at all. It says the artistic, literary, and cultural elite, which I think if you read between the lines, you probably know who that means. But I didn't really think of it as part of queer history, and I was interested in how you chose to include that and like Edna Lewis by extension in the book.
Yeah. I mean, I've always been fascinated, of course, by Edna Lewis, the great Edna Lewis, the great cookbook author and restaurant cook. But also just by this sort of myth, this kind of mythic presence of Cafe Nicholson, both in the life of New York City, and beyond, how it became this, the kind of bohemian spot, in post-World War II New York City at a time when, the city, after the war, the city was tearing down historic buildings and sort of, had this eye to the future that Johnny Nicholson and Carl Bissinger and Edna Lewis built this thing that, Johnny and Carl would roam the streets of Manhattan and, pick up pieces of architectural salvage, old Victorian buildings, Gothic windows and that, and just sort of created this space that felt very, very strange in 1949 in New York City. There was nothing else like it, but it became, as you say, this bohemian spot where everybody wanted to be seen. I mean, Tennessee Williams would hang out there, Truman Capote. And it was, it was a challenge to the dominant culture surrounding it. And what I was fascinated by, thinking about Edna Lewis, I mean, I don't know what Edna's sexuality was. I mean, she was married to a man, but she kind of came up in New York City in this world of, in this queer circle of artists and communists and photographers and, window dressers, and sort of found her creative voice in this world that was completely permissive. And I wanted to try to challenge readers to expand the idea of queerness, not just to be about sexual desire, but to be about people who are sort of creating something that challenged the sort of repressive norms of their time. And so, an inexperienced Black cook, who'd come up in the Great Migration from the South, found this circle of creatives who then could become creative together and sort of out of, literally garbage that people left on the street, build this really amazing space. And Edna learned to cook there, found her voice. And I love that idea that queerness is not limited to gay men or lesbians or, that it's a mood and a movement, rather than merely a sexual orientation. The sort of power of the marginalized to build something that then goes on to change the culture at large.
Yeah, I think it's so beautiful. And it goes to this point of when you're digging into the past, like there are some things that we just can't know. And also some, contemporary mentalities about queerness as a form of gender expression or expansive sexuality that concept didn't exist in the past. And we're trying to kind of frame the past in our present. Also the food there, like I feel like chocolate souffle, which was her signature, like that feels kind of queer to me, right? Like,
yeah, it does. Totally. I mean, going back to talking about the sort of burgers of my Uncle Lou, just sort of not worried about anything but an intensely pleasurable experience. I think, and Edna was doing that. She was not in a place to have been able to eat in fancy or fine French restaurants in New York City. So she was having to figure this out by herself, like, make a béarnaise sauce, essentially doing French cooking, teaching herself French cooking through kind of, feeling her way and not being constrained by many rules.
Yeah. I think like this is one of the many restaurants that I wished I could have been at that table. And I'm curious for each of you, maybe Erik to start, if there's a restaurant from the past that you wish you could kind of be transported back into and what you wish you were eating there.
Yes, I don't wish to go back to the 80s and AIDS, which was not a decade that I would want to go back to. However, if I could go back in the early 80s to Gallus in Atlanta, which is one of the strangest gay restaurants that I have come across. It was in the sort of burgeoning days of the gay neighborhood in Atlanta. And on the second floor was a white tablecloth, fine dining kind of restaurant. They had steak, they had chicken, flowers in vases. And it was that kind of a space. And then you walked on the third floor. There was a cabaret. You could have dessert. You could have a drink. And then in the basement was the hustler area. So a gentleman, usually a gentleman of a certain age and temperament, could have a lovely dinner, sing Mac the Knife with his fellow queens over dessert, and then finish the night with a hustler. And that was your evening. I cannot imagine a place like that existing anywhere today. But the idea that it's kind of a one-stop shopping, like department store, gay restaurant for fancy people who are aspirationally looking for a lovely night, but there's also danger there. It's an absolutely bizarre restaurant that I would go to. I would make a reservation there tonight if a time machine existed.
It is so surreal. And in the book, you mentioned this YouTube video that I found that's like a commercial for the restaurant. But like, how would you even
watch that too? Yeah.
How would you explain the video?
Yeah, the video was sort of this like lovely. It's so authentic and so sweet, and the manager has this lovely Southern accent, and he just wants everyone to come to Gallus and enjoy the chicken. And then it's kind of like a little tour of the space. There's the dining room, and then I think maybe they go upstairs, but then they go downstairs to the basement where these like hot 80s guys and like mustaches and like muscle tees are smiling and pouring drinks and everything. And what they don't show are the trade, the hustlers in the basement. Or the fights that would break out on the street, and
the cops coming by.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just oh man, that was a hoot. I wish I could go back to that restaurant at that time and just experience love and romance and show tunes, but then also sex or like
and
dangerous
nice
sex. Yeah, it's so weird.
John, where would you take the time machine?
I would take the time machine to late 1940s San Francisco to the Paper Doll, which was a restaurant and bar in North Beach. It opened in 1944. The owner was not gay, and it was open for a few years. And then he brought in this woman named Mona Sargent, who is not queer either. But Mona Sargent had run this really successful lesbian bar in San Francisco called Mona's. She was kind of famous for that. And she sort of took on the Paper Doll and she turned it, as someone at the time said, she just kind of flipped a switch and made it gay. And it became this bar, restaurant, art gallery that seemed to be that seemed to take everyone's aspirations for what they wanted, everybody who was queer and artistic in San Francisco, and sort of build this place. It enforced a certain respect for the patrons. So there were all these kind of queer bars in San Francisco that were on the tourist circuit. So straight tourists would come to San Francisco, or maybe be on a convention or something, and would want to see queers. Would want to sort of gawk at queer people, and so queer spaces were not purely queer. They were also places where straight tourists, presumably, could come and gawk at queer people. But with the paper doll, it sort of shifted, and it was a place where anyone could walk in there. But there was this kind of enforced respect, even with vice cops, to kind of respect that a man might be wearing makeup and wearing jewelry. Susan Sontag, who was a student at UC Berkeley at the time, would travel across the bay to go to the paper doll. She loved the female servers because she thought they were cute, but also they all dressed like men, which was kind of astonishing. So it was this really kind of explosion of creativity, of queer community. They had a limited amount of restaurant seating. It was essentially a series of booths along one wall. And you would get seated, you would have your own booth for a while, but then as more people came in, so the servers would just sort of shove new people in at your table, and you'd be suddenly you'd be at this communal table. And as someone, a regular said, it was basically the birth of community. You would meet all these other lesbians and gay men in San Francisco who you might otherwise never have known, and you would know that you were part of something. You were part of a community, as you were eating the prime rib or roast chicken.
Yes, and also the live music component. I remember
Live music component, yeah.
Nat King Cole.
Nat King Cole was there for a week, obviously before he became super popular, a superstar. Carmen McRae, the sort of singer and sort of amazing lounge singer, was a frequent guest there. It was, as someone said, there's a reason why Stonewall didn't happen in San Francisco, why it happened in New York City. Even though bars and the paper doll were subject to the same police harassment, the same, vice squad harassment that a lot of other places were. There was a pushing back in San Francisco that didn't really exist in other cities in the same way. So there's this kind of blending of queer community, queer culture that could happen, with supportive straight people as well. It's kind of amazing to think about.
Yeah, and the roast chicken and the prime rib were a draw in their own right, which is, I think, a good way to get people in the door. I guess while we're fantasizing, I'm curious also if you were going to have a queer dinner party, who some of your dream guests, maybe living or dead, you know them or you don't, and what you would want to serve them.
I would definitely want Samuel Stewart, who was quite a character. He was an aspiring author. He was mentored by Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, and became a main source of information for sex researchers, for Alfred Kinsey in the 1950s, because Samuel Stewart kept a little notebook where he described every man he had ever had sex with, and there were many, and so he would write something about what they were into or what their taste was, what they did. And so this became part of Kinsey's research. And then Samuel Stewart just kind of dropped out and became a tattoo artist in Oakland, California. And so Samuel Stewart would be an amazing guest. I'd have to also say, of course, Truman Capote especially a younger Truman Capote, before he became a sort of sad and brittle figure would be amazing. And I think I would say Alice B. Toklas. She just had this terribly funny, biting wit, savage wit, and this just, completely bizarre sense of the world. I think those three would be amazing.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, maybe think about what you would make them while Erik tells me three of his guests.
Well, John is such an elegant, sophisticated writer and person. I'm like his trashier, like brother or something. Like,
oh, come on.
I mean, I would want to go back to like the restaurant. Chuck Renslow, who is one of the fathers of International Mr. Leather, the annual leather competition, had a number of restaurants in Chicago in the 70s and 80s, and one of them was called Grub Steak, which had these beautiful menus of illustrations of Tom of Finland-esque muscle boys with giant bulges and muscles and hankies, and they were farmers and they were miners. It was kind of like absurd, but it was in that era when like the leather identity, sort of the clone look for gay men, was sort of popular. And he had a restaurant called Grub Steak, which was open 24 hours. I believe it was downtown Chicago. And again, it served diner type food, but it was a draw for the city's leather community and kink community. And I cannot imagine what dinner or 3 a.m. breakfast at Grub Steak would have been like. So I would just say Chuck Renslow and any of his like
whoever's there.
Yeah, the leather daddies or the otters and jockstraps who were just like, yeah, let's go have pancakes.
That's perfect. Okay, so I guess, John, would you serve them pancakes or something else?
Ooh, I would not serve them pancakes. I would serve them. I mean, it has to be something elegant. I mean, it has to be something with this sort of queer, kind of elevated sense of, this is who we are. We are this sort of gilded people. I mean, definitely Edna Lewis's chocolate souffle would have to come at the end of the menu. I think. There's this really wicked cookbook. So Gore Vidal, the writer, had this sort of longtime partner, Howard. I can't think of his last name, Howard Peterson or something. And in the late 1960s, he wrote a cookbook that is just wickedly queer. And so he has all these recipes that have these kind of cringe names. They're so gay. There's so there's a dish he has that he says that he claims is basically something that was adapted from what was eaten in ancient Rome, and he calls it cumin covered cock, which is an old chicken cooked with cumin, and
obviously.
Yes, and just these sort of outrageously named dishes. There's one dish that he calls, so he uses a French name for it, and it's like chicken or something, dildo. So, like D''IL, D''EAU.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, he's just, I think I would cook something from that book.
Yeah. The recipe titles make me think about how both of you use queer language in your books. Like you'll say that someone is, giving or serving something, like not in the delivering a dish to the table context, but in the queer context. I'm curious if you considered how much you wanted to use queer language in the books, or if it's just something that came naturally to you as you were writing.
Yeah, I think for me, this is just how I talk. This is me. Like my book is, if you and I just talked, this is how I would talk. So you're going to hear about cock rings and you're going to hear about girl this and et cetera. Like that's just how I talk. So I feel like that sort of comes through in my book. I'm a journalist, and the last thing that I wanted to do with this book was to put myself into it. But my editors convinced me, no, people want you in this book. Take readers along on a journey. So bring yourself If it's about sex, talk about it. If it's about if it's going to make you cry, talk about it. And so I had a little bit of a hard time sort of finding that within me to sort of bring that through. But yeah, no, I never really thought twice about, oh, maybe I shouldn't say this. Actually, there were some words that my editors I didn't know what like an otter. Like, what is an otter? So I had to explain what an otter was, and I do in my book, which is fine because I hope there are readers who aren't. Not everyone's going to know what, like my mom doesn't know what an otter is. So
now she does.
Now she knows.
I wanted to write something, and I'm assuming that Erik, you did as well, but something that feels, that feels deeply embedded in queer history and queer community, queer consciousness, but that, invites every reader in. So something that is basically, an argument to maybe a non-queer readership about the formation of queer culture or how we sustain queer culture. So I think, having those sort of gateposts where maybe a queer reader feels comfortable, feels spoken to or seen, but that also kind of invites a non-queer reader in who might be curious to discover more, or just to be sort of wrapped up in some of this culture that we talk about, who can sort of feel the texture of it. And so I think using certain language is really helpful in doing that. And I think it just, with both of our books, I think it just kind of establishes our authority, our authenticity as, writers who can speak to this community, who can speak to this history.
Yeah, I think it's like saying our versus your, right? You're including yourself as a part of this community.
Yeah. And that was really important for me, to feel like this is a continuum. Both Erik and I are writing in a historical moment about the past and about the present. And hopefully it gives readers a sense of what's possible in the future.
Yeah, I want to talk about that more. I think, where obviously these books are coming out in a moment where queer people have a lot of freedoms that maybe they didn't previously in the book. Like, we're not in this era where you have to wear 3 articles of clothing of your assigned gender at birth as people had to in the past. But at the same time, queer people are under a lot of attack, especially our trans siblings. And I think a lot of the queer elders that I talk to say, look at the past in moments like this. I'm curious for both of you what it feels like to be publishing these books in this moment and how you think looking back at these queer histories can kind of guide us in this present.
Yeah, I would say that I hope my book, especially the sections where I talk about activism, whether it's in the court or whether it's in the streets, like I talk about ACT UP, I talked about feminists, the lesbian feminists, whatever era we're talking about, I hope that people can read this book and say, no, now's not the time to sit back, because here are 50 examples of ways that queer people in the past have used restaurants as places to organize, as places to mobilize and say, we're not going to take this anymore, or where they have filed lawsuits. I talk about this case at Papa Shoe in Los Angeles where 2 lesbians were denied the romantic couples booths one night. And that turned into a very important case about civil rights, not just in California, but across the country. And so if queer people did it then, I think we can do that now. And it's going to require you to not just send out a message on Facebook or say something angry on TikTok. No. It might require you to take to the streets. And I hope my book is a little bit of a way to sort of say, we did it before and we could do it again.
Mm.
Yeah, I think, food has become such an expressive medium, a medium for self-expression and for connecting people. And I think, the great story of queer food is how, within this bigger struggle for queer civil rights over the 20th century, how food was an important component of that, but also how just general perceptions of food changed, how, cookbooks started out in the early 20th century as just these recipe compendiums with very little personality, or if there was personality, was invented. Like Betty. It had the face of a made up person like Betty Crocker behind it, and how over the course of the century, food, the language of food, cookbooks, how we cook for family, who we consider family, the people who sit around our table, how that has evolved to really fit the moment and really has this sense of urgency for the moment. I hope the lesson is that we have the power. Like, previous generations of queer people were defined by this huge, immovable seeming power structure, where judges, the police, psychiatrists were telling us what queerness was, that it was a sickness, that it was criminal, that it was transgressive. And, the great story of queer liberation was us as a community being able to take the reins and say, no, this is who we are. This is what we are. This is how we love. This is how we build families. This is how we cook for and nurture the people who we love. And so I want that to continue. I want the lesson from both of our books to be that we have the power to define ourselves. And in this, particularly dark moment where it feels like all kinds of things are being reversed, possibility of things being reversed, we can hold on to that power. And we can say, draw the line and say, no, this is who we are. And you can see who we are by how we cook, how we live, what our homes are like, what our restaurants are like. That's the message that I hope readers take.
Yeah, I think reading both of your books, whether it's about being out in a restaurant or in my home or in my friend's home, I think the takeaway is this is a time to gather together and to feed each other because we're all humans and we need to eat to survive, but also that cooking is how you can exert who you are, can share that with other people, and can build these worlds and these families that are so much greater than yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Amen.
Yeah.
I feel like we could keep talking forever, but honestly, that might be a really good point to leave the conversation. I guess to close, I'll do two more questions. The first is if you could each shout out one of your favorite queer spaces to eat in today.
Yeah, I'll say Little Deb's Oasis. I'll snag Little Deb's Oasis in Hudson, New York, which when I walked in there felt like it had the strangest feeling of that people there were expecting me somehow. That I had this sense of recognition, like everybody. I mean, it sounds like a cliche, but that everybody in the room felt like they belonged there. And I felt like I was being told that I belonged there too. So whatever magic, through decor, food, it just feels like the place of acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
Nepalese Lounge and Grill in Green Bay, Wisconsin. They have a monthly transgender meetup there for trans folks from around the region. And it's just such a safe space for people who live in small town Wisconsin or Illinois. And the only place where they can sort of live their lives sort of out and genuinely as trans people is at this restaurant, which, by the way, does not serve food from Nepal. It's just called Nepalese. That's the only place where they can truly express themselves once a month, and they serve a killer fried white cheese curd. It comes in this, one of those plastic red baskets with the grease thing on it, and I scarfed down an entire basket of white cheese curds with some dipping sauce at the bar, and I had a complete blast. I felt so welcome, and now I have a love for Wisconsin cheese curds that I didn't know I had.
Well, it's a good thing to know that you love. Your horizons expanded. Okay, final question for each of you. A fictional food scene, like from a book or a movie, that you wish you could magically eat in real life.
Well, I think I would say a play that I write about in my book called The Nance, which was written by Douglas Carter Bean. And the very first scene is set at an automat in New York City. I have never been to an automat before. These huge cafeteria style places where you'd put a coin in a slot and you'd open a door and you'd get a piece of pie or you'd get a roast beef dinner. And there's a scene in that play between two men who meet there and then form this romance from that meeting. And I would go there just to eat at an automat, which sounds like a dream, but also just to see how cruisy it was, because in the 30s, the heyday of the automats, there were no pride flags. You didn't wear your pride T-shirt walking through the dining room. You had to sort of look carefully or wear maybe an article of clothing in a shade of lavender or other ways to signal, hey, I see you, you're gay, I'm gay. Let's maybe share a cup of soup and I live nearby. You want to come over after this? I would not want to be as deeply closeted and scared as it was in the 30s to be gay. But man, that would be a scene that I would love to recreate that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned the automats. I wish we had like 7 hours to talk because it was so interesting reading about, I feel like I read, Patti Smith's memoir. She talks about meeting Allen Ginsberg at an automat, like these kind of third spaces that they were. And in your book, you say they're one of the only spaces that unaccompanied women could be in by themselves. Like they couldn't dine in a restaurant. So especially if you were a woman looking to meet another unaccompanied woman, the automat would be the place to do that.
Yeah, and people would just think you're gal pals just there, having some coffee. But
people still think we're gal pals.
Yeah, exactly.
John, what's your fictional food scene?
Well, my fictional food scene is queer in spirit. So it's the famous dining scene in the late 1960s film Tom Jones, in which Tom Jones has a dinner across the table from a woman who he's going to sleep with. So the situation is straight, but everything about it is so queer, like the way that they're sort of, tonguing, chicken wings across the table at each other, or it's completely scandalous, feels completely queer. And although I never had this actual experience when I was younger in San Francisco, there were dinner parties that seemed inspired by that sense of seduction. There was this couple who were kind of infamous for, inviting a third partner into their bed, these two guys, and they would invite you over for dinner. And if they cooked rabbit for you that you would eat with your hands, you knew that you were going to end up in bed with them. So it's this sort of tradition of seductive dinners. I will say that they did invite me over once, and they did not serve rabbit.
Oh, scandalous.
Oh, damn.
Brutal.
I know. It was like, what?
Oh.
So, yeah.
Well,
but yeah, that scene from Tom Jones is really amazing. And I argue it is quintessentially queer.
I love this idea. I love the symbolic rabbit. I'm going to be thinking about that for a long time.
I know.
I'm sorry.
And of course, I've spent like years like, wait, why? What was wrong with me?
It's not you, John.
It's not
them.
Yeah, it's not me. Exactly.
Well, thank you both so much for writing these beautiful books, really, and sharing them not only with our community, but with the larger world and coming on the show to talk about them. I really have enjoyed this conversation, and I think maybe queer food will never be singularly defined, but we've come up with a lot of really great definitions for it today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
This is Taste is hosted and produced by Matt Rodbard and me, Eliza Barbanel. The show is edited by lead producer Clayton Gumbert and supervised by Pat Stango, Director of Media Production and Development at Penguin Random House. Thanks to Shalia Harris and the production team at Penguin Random House. Theme music by Steve Rydell, logo and guest illustrations by Ellie Skurzat. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter to keep updated on all cool things in the world of taste.